Picture this. You're a parent, and your kid is going through a tough time. You can see the signs of struggle clear as day. He's sad, irritable, and he just isn't enjoying the things he used to, like playing hockey with friends or going to school. You finally get in to see a psychiatrist, but she tells you that his symptoms aren't significant enough to consider a diagnosis of depression. You're left scratching your head. Clearly, your son is struggling, and you want to get him the help that he needs. But according to the current system we use to diagnose mental health disorders, there's nothing going on. And unfortunately, you kind of need the label of a diagnosis to unlock access to things like treatment and funding, if not just to help your son make sense of what's happening. Now, what if I told you that the wheels are turning? A new way of classifying mental health disorders is in the works. It's called the HiTOP model, and I'm not talking about the Converse All-Star. HiTOP stands for Hierarchical Taxonomy of Psychopathology. The short of it is that HiTOP sees psychopathology as both dimensional and hierarchical. Dimensional means that mental health problems and their symptoms fall on a spectrum, rather than into strict categories. Hierarchical means that mental illness is categorized at multiple levels, ranging from ultra-specific, like the unique traits and symptoms each person with mental illness has, to mega-broad, the idea that there's one big overarching factor that puts people at risk of developing a mental health problem. Don't worry, this will hopefully make more sense by the end of this video. My name is Macy, and I'm a fourth-year student at the University of Victoria. Although I've taken a whole lot of coursework in sociology, check out my videos on the sociology of moral panics, that's a shameless plug, I mostly study mental health in the context of child and adolescent development. I love being a student. My university education gives me access to materials that I wouldn't have otherwise, like books, databases, and recent research. My goal is to help break down the barriers to higher education by taking the knowledge I'm collecting as a university student and translating it for a general audience. Enough about me. I'm here to share what I've learned about an exciting development in psychology. To understand how cool HiTOP is, we need to have a good picture of how the current system of classification and diagnosis looks. Right now, psychiatrists use a guidebook called the DSM-5 to diagnose disorders. The DSM includes categories like anxiety disorders, depressive disorders, and personality disorders. And within these categories, there are specific disorders that clinicians can diagnose based on a list of exhaustive criteria. The DSM is very medical. It's been criticized because it focuses heavily on neurobiology, that's the brain differences and chemical imbalances that are seen as underlying many mental health disorders. By taking a biological, medical view, the current system tends to overlook the issues that are important for everyday life for people with mental health problems, like symptoms and illness course. Plus, the categorical model that the DSM-5 is based on leaves a large group of people with symptoms that don't reach the threshold for a diagnosis, like our imaginary son at the beginning of this video, even though they're suffering. And it doesn't account for how people with the same disorder can have a super different profile of symptoms. One kid with depression might present in a totally different way than another. Here's where HiTOP comes in. Psychologists developed it as a framework to address the pitfalls of the current system of diagnosis. We're all different, and research is showing that it's hard to sort our mental health challenges into strict little diagnostic boxes. Instead, HiTOP views mental health as dimensional, as a spectrum. The idea of the spectrum isn't that new to most of us. It's kind of like how autism is called autism spectrum disorder. Researchers and clinicians have noticed that autism manifests very differently in each person. There's a wide variation in the type and severity of symptoms people experience. The HiTOP model takes this idea and applies it to all disorders. Instead of viewing mental health as a collection of categories that you're either in or out of, we can think of it as a graded dimension. Picture this. You think your daughter might have social anxiety. Social anxiety disorder is a discrete category in the DSM-5, but the HiTOP model would see it as a continuum, ranging from people who experience mild discomfort in a few social situations, for example, when giving a talk in front of a large audience, nerve-wracking for most of us, to people who are paralyzed with fear in most situations. A psychiatrist who's taken a HiTOP approach would tell you that your daughter's symptoms would fall somewhere on this spectrum, and that clinical levels of social anxiety aren't fundamentally different from regular feelings of social discomfort, just more. In this way, HiTOP allows us to recognize mental health struggles that might fall short of diagnosis in the current system. Then, there's the other revolutionary aspect of the HiTOP model, viewing mental health disorders hierarchically. Classifying the dimensions of mental illness at multiple levels of hierarchy allows doctors and researchers to focus on finer symptoms in detail or assess broader problems as necessary. At the most specific level, HiTOP looks at the signs and symptoms individuals express, like our imaginary son's irritability and loss of enjoyment. And at the broadest level, something called spectra, which are these broad overlying factors, like internalizing, externalizing, and detachment. Through some statistical wizardry, a bunch of psychologists who are way smarter than me have figured out that there's an even bigger, overarching dimension that accounts for the covariation of all mental illness. This is called the P factor. At this broad, superspectral level, HiTOP helps us to explain why mental health disorders are comorbid, or co-occur. It's quite common for kids to have more than one type of struggle when it comes to their mental health or their development. If you're a parent of a child with depression, for example, you know that they're vulnerable to also having anxiety. Psychologists are thinking that there are some general processes and features that are common to all people with mental health disorders, and the P factor encapsulates these. For example, I've been doing some research for my advanced adolescent development class about the P factor and personality disorders in teenagers. Research has found a strong association between the P factor and certain personality traits. First, the P factor is connected to neuroticism, which is the disposition towards negative feelings like anger, anxiety, self-consciousness, irritability, and depression. The P factor has also been linked with lower levels of self-regulation, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. And importantly, these same dimensions of personality have been connected to the development of personality disorders. Things that under the current DSM-5 system are called borderline personality disorder, paranoid personality disorder, avoidant personality disorder, and more. Kids and teenagers aren't often assessed for personality disorders, but viewing them as a set of dimensions rather than categories might make it easier to understand how the foundation for these disorders begins in childhood. This recent research, shout out to Shields and colleagues 2022, on personality and personality disorders, shows us that HiTOP and the P factor are helping us to understand a diverse range of mental health problems. I can foresee a not-so-distant future where instead of seeing if a child meets a list of criteria in the DSM, clinicians are able to look at the array of symptoms they have and develop a plan of action based on their strengths and challenges, rather than sticking a diagnosis on them. I might be a bit of a nerd for psychology, but I think that this new model is exciting. The best part about HiTOP is that it comes directly out of the most up-to-date scientific evidence, rather than relying on tradition and expert opinion like the DSM-5. I think that HiTOP is giving us an excellent opportunity to step away from grand labels like major depressive disorder and towards an understanding of the unique challenges and strengths each person has. Basically, the main nugget I want you to take away from this video is that we don't need to see mental health as this array of discrete diagnostic categories with fences around them. Yes, diagnosis is important because it drives treatment and research for mental illnesses, but the most up-to-date research is suggesting it's time to rethink how we do things. Thanks for listening.